First, I want to welcome everybody in the audience. It's a pleasure to be here. What an incredible event this was. I could speak for 30 minutes about how excited I am about Bookfest, but we have more important things to do at this point, and it really is a privilege and honor to be able to really do a deep dive into one of the true leaders of not only foundations, but the nonprofit community, and sort of get his views about where we're going. I do want to exercise a brief personal privilege as a proud president. Akira Shelton is a student of mine who is in the Tulane Honors program, and is just extraordinary, not only as a student, but as a leader. And I fully expect 20 years from now, the then president of Tulane University will be interviewing her. So look, this is an incredible moment for us to sort of talk about your vision of philanthropy. You're obviously an incredible leader, not only of one of the most important nonprofit institutions in the world, but a visionary about where the nonprofit world should be heading. As part of that, you've written this really incredible book, which we're going to talk about, From Generosity to Justice, A New Gospel of Wealth, which is a play on Andrew Carnegie's book, Gospel of Wealth. Sort of turns it on its head. Obviously, we want to discuss that. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about you and your past and your history. You grew up in Lafayette, Louisiana, oh yes, let's hear it for Lafayette. I think it's safe to say you didn't grow up in a world of privilege. You were one of the first classes, maybe the first classes in Head Start. You've crossed incredible racial, social, economic barriers, a product of public education, and now you're really on to the pinnacle of nonprofit leadership. Could you just tell us a little bit about that journey, how you got from Lafayette to where you are today?
Well, thank you very much, President Fitz. It's such a thrill for me to be in New Orleans. This is a magical city. And as someone who gets to travel, I'm very privileged in my role because the foundation has offices in 10 different regions around the world. I'm so lucky to travel a lot. And it's really interesting internationally, the number of American cities that actually have what I would call brand identity. And there's Detroit, of course. New Orleans also has a global brand identity. I know that because when we were working with my good friend Walter Isaacson and Ann and King Milling and so many others on the challenge post-Katrina, when I traveled abroad, so many people were very aware of what had happened and were really watching. And so it's always a thrill. And when Cheryl and Walter approached me about this 3 years ago, I jumped at the chance to come, because who doesn't jump at the chance to come to New Orleans? And I will say I decided to stay with friends who are New Yorkers who bought a house here. And this morning over lunch, I mean, they are the quintessential New Yorkers. I mean, it's a sort of gay couple who are incredibly successful and who have 5 houses and they love, and they said the great silver lining of COVID is that we've fallen in love with New Orleans because we've been here and we don't want to leave. And it was so interesting to hear one of them say, I'm really lamenting having to leave and go back to New York, which to me as a New Yorker, I was wounded, I have to say. I was wounded because I am one of these New Yorkers who feels that we've got to love New York. But it was interesting to experience someone who came to New Orleans and have just fallen in love with the city and don't want to leave. And I understand why. So the journey for me, actually I was born in Lafayette, Louisiana. I was, and my family, my mother's family, well, I didn't really know my father, but I know that he was from Opelousas or someplace like that. I know it was close because my family is in Lafayette and Opelousas and Rayne and Crawley and all of these towns, dotting old interstate. I guess it was Highway 90 we used to take when I was a kid from Beaumont, outside of Beaumont in Liberty County where I lived. So I did actually go to Texas as a little boy, and my mother moved us to Liberty, Texas, which is between Beaumont and Houston. And we lived not in Liberty. The irony is that Liberty was the name of the town and the county seat, but blacks couldn't live in Liberty. And so the next town, which was Ames, population 1,200, is where we lived. And we lived on a dirt road in a little shotgun house. And one day in 1965, in the spring of 1965, a lady was walking down the road, going from little house to little house, and she approached our porch where my mother and I were sitting, and she told my mother about a new program that President Johnson had initiated called Head Start, and that they were going to have the first class of Head Start in the summer, that summer. And so I was lucky enough to be enrolled in the first class of Head Start. And my friend Marian Wright Edelman always loves telling that story because she's constantly pulling me to come and advocate in Washington for Head Start, which I'm happy to do. But it truly did begin me on the journey. And it I think in many ways, initiated my love of reading and my interest in the world outside of the world that I lived in. And it absolutely began a journey of public education, which is for me really critical in a democracy. And I say that, and it is on my official bio, and I make sure that whenever I do panels or from Davos to Aspen or wherever, I have that included in my bio because I'm usually the only person who can say, I've never had a day of private education. My entire education represents the public's investment and belief in me. And I think in a democracy, that statement by leaders in this country is rarer and rarer. And I think that is a problem. I think it's a problem when you're in places like Davos and Aspen on panels and no one has gone to public anything. And so for me, I'm really proud, and it's partly why I'm an advocate for public institutions. And the journey to Ford, in so many ways, was made possible by Ford because the Ford Foundation indeed funded the early experiments on what became Head Start in the New Haven, a town you are familiar with, in the New Haven schools. And I, of course, went to college on a Pell Grant. That, too, was something the Ford Foundation invested early research in. And I was lucky enough to run a community development corporation in Harlem, which, again, was something the Ford Foundation was very involved in. So it felt like, for me, when I was lucky enough to join Ford, that in some ways I was coming home.
So I guess I was going to ask you, in a sense, how that history informed your service at Ford, but you've literally explained that you bring to the foundation a series of experiences and backgrounds that few other of your predecessors have. And obviously that's shown you sort of a new direction. I want to start about your book, which obviously you wrote it while you had a day job running the Ford Foundation. And obviously you brought to the foundation sort of a new view about what it should be supporting. But what led you to write the book, first of all? Why did you feel the need to sort of step back and sort of talk about a new vision for philanthropy and for foundations?
Well, I was introduced to philanthropy through the lens of working at the Rockefeller Foundation. And at Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller was very inspired, of course, by his own religious beliefs and giving and charity, but also Andrew Carnegie's book, his seminal 1898 book, and the essay in it that was the Gospel of Wealth, in which he laid out what became really the foundations of what we think of as institutional philanthropy in this country and the way donors give. And in it, he talked about the imperative of charity, of generosity, of things like literacy. When I became president, I was truly searching for a framework because I need frameworks in my life. I don't know about you, but I need frameworks because the world is so complicated to think about a set of values that actually you can consistently apply is hard. And I read a really obscure speech that Martin Luther King had given in which he talked about philanthropy in 1968. And what he said was, philanthropy is commendable, but it should not allow the philanthropist to overlook the economic injustice which makes philanthropy necessary. And so what Dr. King was saying was something different. He was saying, yes, charity and generosity should inspire you to give, but the pursuit of justice and dignity should also inspire you, and that charity is not enough, that actually human dignity and justice should also be a part of one's thinking about the role of what giving should help address. And so it is not just ameliorative, but really looks at the root causes. And so it made it, that allowed me to think about a different framework that was differentiating in part because at the time, I was in the midst of, with my trustees, really reimagining the foundation, everything from our mission to our grant making, our programs, where we worked in the world, what we worked on, our headquarter building in New York, our art collection that had no women or people of color in it, all sorts of things that I really wanted the board to think about. And it gave me a frame. And so it allowed me to say, how do we move? Yes, let's celebrate, and we should feel good when we give, and donors should feel good about giving. But what Dr. King was saying was, it's not enough to feel good that you've written a check and you are seeking. You need to actually get a little uncomfortable. And he was saying what Congressman Lewis reminded us, that certainly in our religious teachings, in our own faith traditions, this idea of addressing these issues ought to make us uncomfortable. And what I write about in the book is just how difficult that is in a society and with a population of people, like most of us in this room, who are privileged. The whole idea of privilege is to insulate ourselves from feeling uncomfortable. the number of times my mother said, who worked so hard, never saved a dollar, but she always said, I work so hard so that you can have something better, a better life, and some privilege that I didn't have. And every parent says that and wants that for their child. But in a society where there's growing inequality and where people like me have benefited inordinately, disproportionately, as inequality has grown in our society, which is so harmful to our democracy. This question of how we think about justice and dignity and our own privilege, I wanted to make that a part of the discourse about giving.
So what is so remarkable about the book is, yes, it's a story about how an incredible foundation like the Ford Foundation should be thinking about how to expend its resources, but it's also directed to philanthropists across the country and individuals across the country about how they should think about what they're doing in their own philanthropy.
But can I just on this, President Fitz, say that is right, but part of this was not to be dogmatic or ideological or to say, I'm telling you what you should think about.
Right.
It was more to extend what Rockefeller and Carnegie talked about, because they brought this notion of root causes, of the work. John D. Rockefeller's work on scientific research was really getting at the root causes of health, of literacy, and for his era, for their era, they, and certainly Carnegie, and absolutely Rockefeller in his own way, the foundations were radical. I mean, John D. Rockefeller actually thought in 1892 that Black women should go to college. That was a radical idea of a wealthy white man, or anybody in this country. Remember, this was a country where literally there were states where illiteracy was compulsory by law of African Americans. It was illegal to have African Americans be literate. And so for John D. Rockefeller to say, actually, I'm going to give $100,000 to this Negro Women's Baptist, whatever the predecessor name of Spelman College was, because I believe Black women should get a 4-year degree. Now, he wasn't, just to be clear, he didn't say, and they should go to Smith with my daughters. No, just to be clear, that was radical for the context, and it's why context is important and context does matter. What I was trying to do was to extend that with the book, to say, actually, Black women should have a choice. If they want to go to Smith, like your daughters, they should. And I think what I was trying to do with the book was to expose some of the really difficult truths about root causes that Rockefeller or Carnegie didn't address and couldn't really address because of the times in which they lived. I'm not excusing it, I'm simply saying context does matter. And so they weren't looking at issues of racism, which was a root cause. Right? So you can't, Andrew Carnegie built libraries across America, which was, again, a radical idea, because in Europe, what existed were libraries for the rich that were built privately for the rich. This notion that every town and hamlet should have a Carnegie Library was a radical ideal. But Andrew Carnegie was okay with the fact that there were Negro libraries that were second tier, second quality, with the discarded books from the main Carnegie libraries. And what I wanted to do was to actually engage in that issue as a root cause. I mean, the issue of you can't talk about literacy in the American South and the history of literacy as Carnegie was engaging in, and not deal with the fact that it was illegal for blacks to be literate in some jurisdictions in the South. And that was because of racism and white supremacy, which is really hard to talk about. It is uncomfortable, it is shameful, and it's something that is so antithetical to our ideals as a country and the things we aspire. Jefferson said the work of America is to build a great nation that is just. That's what Jefferson said to his friend Samuel DuPont. So I want to hold Jefferson to his words. And I believe those words that Jefferson wrote to his friend Samuel DuPont. And I think in philanthropy, we need to take up the mantle and ask questions not just about generosity, but about justice.
It reminds me of the famous Langston Hughes poem, "For the dream to be saved for one, it must be saved for all." And it's a statement of generosity, but trying to bring people into the shared vision. I don't know how many people here have read the book, but it's a marvelous series of vignettes and interviews with people across the country who've been involved in philanthropy and running organizations or in one way or another, and how they came to understand their obligations morally to social justice. I know you love all your children, but are there any of those cases that jump out at you as sort of illustrating your point more generally?
Well, I think the cases that I wrote are all people I know, and what I think among the things that are interesting are the contrasts. So the contrast between David Rockefeller Jr., who is the epitome of inherited wealth, sixth generation, and John Arnold, who was a trader, made some great trades, and is a billionaire at age 38. Sort of the notion of the self-made and the notion of the inherited. And what I find is that the self-made are more impatient, probably more imperious, and more confident. And someone like David is grappling with inheriting, and that inheritance is a different burden and is a different challenge. And because I do engage with newer donors, newer philanthropy, and inherited wealth, it's just a really interesting perspective and contrast of styles and personalities and approaches to giving.
You speak very forcefully in the book about the importance of both philanthropists and institutions engaging with the individuals for whom they're, in a sense, intending to support, and involving them directly in the decision-making in the process. Could you, I have to ask, what led you to view that as so important? How do you do that at the Ford Foundation?
Well, I think when you talk about, lived experience, often there is such a gap between donors, people like many of you in this room who are generous and want to make a difference in your community and in the world, and the lived experience of the people you're trying to help. Their experience, your children's experience versus their children's lived experience. And this idea of proximity, which Brian Stevenson, who's on my board, and we're so lucky to have Brian at Fort as a trustee, and Brian talks about this all the time, getting proximate to the places and people and communities you want to affect. And the lived experience for me of feeling such a chasm between communities like mine or my own lived experience. I often think, sometimes, and I do this in the book, where I've talked about my own experience and how that affected me and what I brought. When I was 13, I had my first job, and I was a busboy in a restaurant. And the thing about being a busboy when you're 13, in 1972, in the small town in Texas, is you're invisible. I mean, you're the lowest person with the dishwasher on the organizational chart. And so your job is to clean the bathrooms and bus tables. And your existence is really one of invisibility. I mean, you are in a place, and your job is to be as discreet and as invisible as possible. And often people treat you that way. And I do think about how so many people in our country feel invisible, that the way I walked around the room and bussed tables and would take things from people who were clearly privileged and have it obviously more economic power, I was invisible to a lot of those people. And I think about that and being proximate to people who feel invisible. And I see it in our politics. It's partly why I think the level of growing inequality in our society has only exacerbated the sense of people feeling that their needs, their priorities are ignored, and that they are disfavored. And I can relate to that. And I think being able to relate to that makes me at least emotionally more proximate. I know what it feels like to come home and have a notice of eviction on the front door. I know what it feels like to be waiting for your mother to pick you up from debate, and she doesn't come because her car has been repossessed. And so if you have that lived experience, it allows you, when you are engaging on these issues, to bring that with you. And so the way we get proximate really depends on that lived experience. I still think I need to be proximate, but it's really hard for me to be proximate because the way our society is structured and the way we live our lives is very much a function of income, of economics, of geography, of our own aspirations. And so you have to, at least in my case, I have to work to do that because the sort of conveyor belt of my daily routine would only have me in places like Aspen and Davos. I love Aspen Walter, but yeah, exactly, never again Davos. But yes, that's why being proximate is important. And that forward, the way we do that is we say, let's look at how we do participatory grant making in which we don't just allow the credentialed program officers to review grant applications. Let's give $15 million to a Black Feminist Fund and let Black community-based grassroots feminist organizations decide how they're going to disperse the money. And let's evaluate that. Let's put 5 years on that. And let's from the beginning say to that group, we're giving this money unrestricted. You all set up the guidelines for how you want to disperse it. We are going to hold you accountable for evaluation, just like we do all our grants, but you decide. And let's see 5 years what kind of impact you have. So I think those kinds of experiments are really important.
So you also speaking eloquently and passionately about the importance of diversity in not only in organizations but in decision making. How have you seen evidence of the positive impacts of diversity, and how do you ensure that at part of the Ford Foundation and its grantees?
Well, I think it's really unfortunate that diversity has, in the eyes of some, taken on the moniker of, if we are pursuing diversity, we are lowering our standards, we are lessening the chance we will achieve excellence. And I really regret that the way it was really introduced was in that Supreme Court case of Alan Bakke around quotas, which the Supreme Court deemed unconstitutional, but that diversity as a state and public objective was constitutional. And I think because diversity was introduced that way, in the eyes of some, it still means that. When what we really know is that diverse organizations outperform less diverse organizations. And there's great research, and Harvard Business Review and McKinsey have done really excellent inventories of the different research agendas on that specific issue because it is so contested. I do believe in a democracy, a representative democracy, a plural, multiracial democracy, that representation matters. And it matters not only because of having faces that look like the country in decision making. It matters because the organizations are better. I have been on many boards, public company boards and other nonprofits, where I am the only person of color, or I'm the only Black person, or maybe the only gay person. But I can say with some degree of certainty that my presence had an impact on the deliberations of those boards. And I can also say that when we moved from what people might have thought was diversity, which was really tokenism. I mean, many of those boards, I was the only African Americans. And I remember a public company board I was on, and when the draft of the proxy was circulated to the directors, and the part about the board, they described the board as diverse, and I'm the only Black on the board. And I said to the CEO, I actually don't think we need to be clear. One is tokenism. Let's make sure we don't conflate tokenism and diversity. And for many of our institutions, the idea of having one was the objective. I mean, to say we've got one was enough. And I actually have fought hard against that, and I know the difference. I know when I look at many of the boards I'm on, but if I were to look at really the public company boards, there's a difference. I was the only Black director on the PepsiCo board, and when all of the horrific things that happened from the murder of George Floyd in that summer and what was happening in the company, the fact that I was there, I am sure, well, I know, had a material impact on the deliberations of the board. When we were joined soon after with a second Black director, in Edith Cooper, who was the first Black woman partner at Goldman Sachs, Edith and my presence on the board, and it wasn't just about diversity issues and ESG. There are a lot of other issues that our input into those deliberations has made for a better company. And I think I can say that at PepsiCo or the National Gallery of Art, which until I was elected had never in its history had an African American trustee until 2019. The National Gallery funded by the American citizens. Yeah, no, I know, it's shocking, isn't it? But no one seemed to, except thank God Sharon Rockefeller thought it was a problem, when Sharon became chair, then she had the authority to say we've got to change, but my point is today you would never, no credible board of a public company or of any institution can exist like that. You don't have any credibility if you look around the room and there's not any diversity. Someone will raise their hand and say, excuse me, has anyone thought about, which I can assure you, because I would be the person raising my hand. And sometimes I would just simply be told, oh, Darren, why do you have to bring up that again? Like you do every nominating and governance meeting. Or when you're told, we agree with you, now you go fix it. Because we don't know any Black people to put on the board. That was what one chair of a nom and gov committee told me a few years ago. So welcome to my world.
I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience, but I started out by saying that you'd really written an extraordinary book about philanthropy and generosity and social justice, but it really is it's a story about our society and the obligations of people in the society. And I'm so delighted that we got to talk about all these issues. Now, Walter Isaacson is sitting in front of me. He's going to fire me in a second because I've already gone over. I've gone over in terms of our time.
Darren and I are up next, so take more time.
But I do want to open it up for questions from the audience about Darren. Yes. What? Do we have a microphone or yes? There we go. Oh, I think we have a mic. Behind you is somebody with a mic. Okay.
Okay. You mentioned that empathy stems from proximity, right? But we also know that liberal and moderate voters that move into conservative enclaves will change their voting habits and grow more conservative over time and actually vote with conservative majorities and whatnot. So my question for you is, as you were talking about how that early experience galvanized you, how do you maintain empathy for others based in that proximity when you are gaining greater and greater access to and are surrounded by the trappings of privilege and wealth and access and whatnot? That's my question.
No, great question about proximity and empathy in these matters. I think part of it is you're right about the research, but for me, this takes me back to talking about the arts, which I will do just for 2 minutes, because so much of why the arts matter in our society is because of the empathy, because of the ways in which they teach us. It's why you want your children to go to museums and be in arts education programs, because we know from the research that it makes young people more empathetic. And you can always, I reflected on this, whenever I have seen a leader who speaks of other human beings in inhumane ways and uses language that degrades the humanity of other people, I always know that that leader has never read beautiful poetry. They've never looked at a painting and been emotionally touched. They've never experienced great literature, because if they had, they wouldn't be using that kind of language, because they'd have empathy and they'd have an understanding that every person has humanity. So just a plug for the arts. Yes, ma'am.
That was wonderful.
I feel the hordes are upon us, but so one more
Can I
question.
ask? Okay, all right.
Yes.
Hi, Connie Jackson. My family has sort of completed the reverse Great Migration. My uncles left here after the Great Flood of 27, great uncles. My mom returned after Katrina when they needed doctors, and my sister and I returned since the pandemic. But to see that half of Black people in this city are either unemployed or retired, with very little opportunity, still very little opportunity, and we have all these wonderful schools where people come and then they leave. How do we, and this is not, New Orleans is special, but it's Chicago, it's so many other cities. And just, we really have to, we talk about generosity, we talk about justice, but until the racism is, the economic benefit of letting go of racism seems to meet with the moral imperative of justice, I don't know what we do. You've been doing some amazing things, but it just feels as if we're still stuck, and the divide is growing, and there's so many people here who are just lost, mostly people of color.
And I think the issue of economics and capitalism, it's why I've written so much about, as a strong believer in capitalism, I do believe it's the best way to organize an economic system. I also know that our system is also imbued with that history of racism. And the difficulty for many people to talk about that. Because for those of us who are privileged, this system has worked for us. I know what it feels like to live with privilege and without, and there's a big difference. And I know what it feels like to go into a bank and walk into the private bank and bypass the lines. And that's a metaphor. And we who are the designers of this system need to come to grips with the ultimate failure of our democracy if we aren't willing to do some redesigning. And that really is about policy, too. You can't have an economic system, a democracy, where a city says, we want to pay our workers in low-wage jobs higher incomes, higher compensation, and the city council pass a policy that does that, and then the business community go to the state capitol and have the state legislature reverse it. Right? Then there really does have to be a conversation about economics and the design of the system so that people like me have to understand that if this system, if this country, if our democracy is going to survive, the trend lines around inequality and who is benefiting don't give us much hope for that. And that's the important point in our democracy. In this democracy, hope is the oxygen of our democracy, and hopelessness is our enemy. Inequality asphyxiates hope. It makes people feel less confident. It actually makes people cynical and unwilling to actually engage in the public square because they don't believe that the systems of government, the systems of the economy care about them. And when that happens, it's really bad news.
Yeah, I'm afraid we could go on for hours, and this has been an extraordinary conversation. I think we all would agree that your perspective is a visible demonstration about the importance of bringing people who have insights from their life to the pinnacles of power. And it's clearly that your history has informed every aspect of your tutelage of the Ford Foundation. But more importantly, this has turned into a discussion about our society and what we need to do for our society. I encourage everybody to read this book because it's a marvelous demonstration of a sense of hope, but a sense of need for this country. So I want to thank Darren. Thank you for this.